The heat in Georgia was unbearable, though Harold Harry Bentley wasn't one to complain. He was a veteran who had been through a lot, so he knew what it was like to work under a blazing sun. His son, Clay, had returned from Atlanta a few years back and now helped him run the farm. In August, the two were preparing for the upcoming harvest. The corn and soybean fields spread over a quarter-mile along the highway, while smaller vegetable plots lay closer to the house. Harold was reluctant to change his tried-and-true farming methods, but he still allowed his son to bring in modern equipment from the city. Clay believed that without modernization, their operation might suffer, though he tried not to push too hard. At dawn, he woke up earlier than his father. He needed to check the cornfield, where weeds continued to sprout despite regular weeding. He also had to inspect the soybean plantings because water often pooled in a low-lying spot after rains. Clay laced up an old pair of boots, stepped onto the porch, and noticed a thick fog rolling across the property. The sky still held a faint pinkish hue. The air smelled of damp earth and slightly scorched grass, left over from a recent mowing. The dogs near the house had their tails tucked and were staring toward the pen. Clay didn't like the look of that. Around 6 in the morning, just as the sun began to cut through the haze, he went to check on the livestock and saw that one of the wooden fence posts by the goat pen was broken. The boards that held the sections together looked as if they had been snapped by a sudden, forceful pull. Clay saw no hoof prints, no blood, no hair. He scratched his head and called his father over. Harold approached, trying not to show his concern, though his narrowed eyes gave away his worry. Livestock had always been their main source of income besides crops, and goats were especially valuable. They discovered that 2 goats were missing. The remaining animals were unusually quiet, pressing themselves against the far edge of the pen. Without waiting for his son to ask, Harold began examining the ground near the break. He suspected coyotes, since they occasionally appeared in the area and carried off small livestock. But the disappearance of 2 goats at once made him doubtful. Clay walked around, trying to find any clues at all. The dry grass near the fence was trampled, but there were no drag marks. The mud on his boots didn't seem like it would yield any evidence, and there was no sign of blood or tufts of fur. Clay found something in the soft ground that looked like a large imprint, reminiscent of a big paw print. Harold knelt down and traced its outline with his finger. It was wider than a typical coyote track and deeper than what a stray dog would leave. When Clay asked if it could be a bear, Harold only shook his head. Bears were extremely rare in that region, and the signs here didn't match a bear attack. Harold stood up, dusted off his hands, and headed to the pickup truck parked behind the house. Clay followed. They argued over whether to call the sheriff's department. Harold believed that Sheriff Marcus Hardy, an old family friend, would simply file a formal report, and that would be the end of it. Clay, on the other hand, felt that a dangerous predator capable of breaking a fence and making off with 2 goats shouldn't be ignored. There were plenty of farmers in the area, and leaving a threat like that unchecked seemed reckless. Harold suggested waiting a couple of days to check the fields to see if this was just a fluke. Deep down, he feared the neighbors' teasing. Around here, folks often joked about anyone claiming mysterious nighttime animal visits. Still, he couldn't shake his worry over the missing goats. Clay decided to put off calling the sheriff so as not to add any more strain. Then they went to the vegetable plots where weeds needed pulling. But both men kept thinking about the strange incident, concerned that it might be more than just coyotes. That same evening, Clay walked along the fence, checking the supports and listening to the sounds of the fields. He rigged up a few homemade alarms using tin cans, hoping they would rattle if anything got inside. Harold sat on the porch, gazing at the yard illuminated by the weak glow of a single lamp. The dogs in their kennel growled softly as though sensing trouble. No strangers had been spotted all day, yet the unease lingered. Before bed, Harold advised Clay to lock the doors and windows. A week passed after the goats disappeared and the farm began to settle back into its usual routine. Harold inspected the soybean crop, eyeing the dried-out soil near the irrigation ditches, trying to keep himself calm. Meanwhile, Clay fiddled with the irrigation system he'd installed a couple of months earlier, hoping to boost the yield. In the evenings, Clay pored over catalogs featuring new types of fertilizers, though his father kept insisting these expenses might not pay off. Still, their nighttime worries grew. The dogs barked at nothing, then started whining and huddling inside the kennel. Harold went out on the porch a few times with a flashlight but never saw anything specific. It seemed there was only a gentle breeze, the rustle of corn leaves, and moonlight on the barn's wooden boards. One night, he did spot a dark shape among the stalks, but it vanished the moment he pointed his light in that direction. In the morning, Harold told his son what he'd seen, but Clay just shrugged. Then Clay remembered an old surveillance camera he'd set up by the soybean field years ago to catch whoever had been stealing tools from his workshop. He had never bothered to take it down, so he decided to check the footage. His father scoffed, thinking it was a waste of time, but didn't stop him. Later that afternoon, Clay visited the spot where the camera was mounted. It was fixed to a fence post about 10 yards from the edge of the cornfield. The power supply was still working. Returning home, he connected the memory card to an old laptop and started reviewing the videos. The image quality was grainy and dim, especially at night, but something strange appeared in one of the frames. A silhouette could be seen moving between the corn rows. It seemed slightly taller than an average person, but what really stood out was the unnatural structure of its limbs. At one point, it rose up on its hind legs, and for a few seconds you could make out what looked like a massive front limb tipped with claws. Clay rewound the footage several times, but it remained blurry. Harold was working on the tractor in the shed when Clay called him over to look at the still frame on the screen. The farmer studied it for a long moment before asking if it might just be a camera glitch or some distortion in the lens. Clay shook his head, saying the fields and animals showed up clearly in other clips. That meant the camera was functioning properly, and the silhouette was of something real. That night they decided to find out who, or what, was roaming around in the cornfield. Harold grabbed a flashlight and his old shotgun while Clay pulled on tall boots to avoid getting cut by stalks and roots. They walked about 100 yards from the house, listening closely to the night sounds. The dogs refused to follow, preferring to stay near the shed. At first, everything was silent. Then, after a few minutes, they heard a long sound, like a mix of raspy breathing and a low growl. Harold froze, shining his light between the rows of corn, catching a glimpse of leaves swaying. Clay took a few steps closer, rifle at the ready, but found only empty space. At that moment, both men felt a creeping unease, as if something out there was watching them. Harold said it wasn't wise to go any farther without the sheriff, and they headed back to the house, trying not to look over their shoulders. Later that night, Clay decided to watch the camera feed in real time. He moved the laptop into the living room and made some coffee. Around 2 in the morning, a tall, dark figure flickered on the screen again. It moved between the corn stalks, sometimes lowering its head as though sniffing the ground. At one point, the creature turned sideways toward the camera, revealing a long forelimb, Then it disappeared off the edge of the frame, leaving Clay even more on edge. At dawn, he showed Harold the new footage, and this time his father didn't deny that an unknown predator had appeared on their land. Both men understood that such a threat demanded serious attention. Yet they kept hesitating, unsure about calling the sheriff without solid evidence, and not wanting to feed any local gossip. The sunrise seemed calm, but Harold felt no peace of mind. He knew from Clay that the camera had once again recorded something strange, and he realized he needed to inspect the other parts of the farm. There was just over a month until the cotton would be ready for harvest, but Harold didn't want to delay another check. He got into his pickup and headed to the far field to make sure everything was all right. The road led past some low hills, and after about half a mile the view opened up onto the white rows of cotton plants. The rising sun tinted the sky with pale shades. Harold parked at the edge of the field, got out, and looked around. He noticed a few rows of bushes were flattened. Stepping closer, he saw broken stems and leaves pressed into the dirt. Something had definitely been here during the night. In the center of the trampled area, he found the remains of a raccoon. Its body was torn apart, scattered bones visible in the dirt. Harold couldn't recall any local predator leaving such brutal evidence. He took out a handkerchief and pressed it to his nose. Though the scent of blood wasn't overpowering, whatever happened must have been recent. Studying the ground, he saw prints resembling elongated paws with large pads. They were much bigger than any coyotes and shaped oddly. Harold thought of feral dogs, but they usually didn't leave such large tracks. The claws looked longer than a typical dog's. Squatting down, he ran a finger along one of the prints, guessing how heavy this creature might be. Back in the truck, Harold sat behind the wheel for a while, thinking about what he'd just seen. He knew people would laugh if they heard talk of some unknown beast. But with 2 missing goats and a mutilated raccoon, the danger was real. Talking to the sheriff would mean confirming the rumors that were already drifting around. He also knew they might need help, but he didn't want to start telling stories until he had more facts. When he got home, Clay was already looking over the vegetables they'd been tending. Clay noticed his father's worried expression and asked if he'd found anything suspicious. Harold gave a brief account of what he'd seen, including the large footprints. Clay listened, then suggested checking for any alerts about escaped predators from traveling carnivals or private menageries anywhere in the state. Over lunch, they searched local websites. Clay called several farmer friends to see if they'd heard of anything similar. No one knew of any missing big cats or wolf hybrids. Harold realized this wasn't a typical case of some fierce animal escaping from a zoo. There was nothing like that in the local news. Clay ventured the idea that maybe it was a rare, oversized dog-wolf hybrid that someone had been secretly keeping as a pet. But Harold argued that even that wouldn't explain these strange prints or how silently the creature slipped through fences and vanished without leaving any blood at the attack sites. Later that day, Becky Rogers, the local vet, stopped by after visiting a couple of cows at a nearby farm. She asked how they were doing since the goats went missing. Harold told her about what he'd found in the cotton field, omitting the more disturbing details. Becky explained that predators might alter their habits when they're starving, but no one had reported sightings of anything that big. She was also surprised to hear about the strange prints. Years of peaceful farming seemed to have come to an abrupt end, and Harold had no idea how far this situation might go. He simply decided it was time to tighten their security. Before bed, he told Clay he planned to check those far fields again in the morning. Clay agreed, but added that doing nothing might lead to more losses. They couldn't put off work, however. The soybean harvest was looming, and Harold and Clay were getting the equipment ready for nighttime harvesting. Despite the troubling events, the job had to be done. Harold went to check the fuel level in the combine, while Clay headed out to inspect the field boundaries to clear the way for the tractor. Dusk settled over the area, tinting the sky yellowish-brown. Humidity remained high, and the soybean leaves felt sticky. Clay walked along the muddy track, listening to the faint sounds of insects. It unnerved him that the dogs stayed back at the farm, as though they were afraid to go into the fields. He remembered the camera footage and couldn't help wondering if that strange creature was out there, hidden among the rows. When the sun had fully set, Clay noticed movement at the far edge of the field, where the soy gave way to a narrow patch of young woods. He saw a dark figure moving faster than he'd anticipated. At first glance, it could have passed for a person, but its height and the shape of its limbs made him doubt that. The figure walked on two legs, but its hunched back and thick coat of fur didn't match anything familiar. Clay stopped, trying not to make a sound, and saw the creature move into the trees, almost disappearing in the dim light. He decided to grab the old rifle he'd been carrying in the tractor for the past few days. When Clay returned to the spot and aimed his flashlight toward the woods, he heard a deep growl, something between a dog's snarl and a wolf's, but rougher and deeper. He took a few steps forward, trying to see through the dense wall of soy and brush. Suddenly, something lunged from the side, hitting him with enough force to knock him down. The rifle flew out of his hands, and the flashlight fell, casting a shaky beam across the ground. Clay tried to lift his head and caught a glimpse of a dark shape with a broad chest and powerful front limbs. The creature let out a short, rasping roar, and he felt a sharp pain in his left shoulder. Claws tore through his shirt, leaving deep scratches on his skin. Clay groaned, but before he could get a clear look at its face or eyes, the sound of an engine came from a distance. It was Harold's pickup. He'd decided to drive over and help his son check the field. The creature jerked away as if startled by the noise. Clay struggled to sit up, clutching his wounded shoulder. He felt warm blood on his fingers through the shredded fabric of his shirt. The pain was intense, but he could still move his arm. As the headlights lit up part of the field, Clay saw the shape disappear among the trees. Harold jumped out of the truck, flashlight in hand, and yelled, "You all right?" Clay couldn't respond clearly. His head was spinning and his heart pounded. Harold helped him to his feet and insisted they go to the hospital, but Clay argued they should first check if the creature was still nearby. Harold refused to risk another encounter and convinced Clay to head back to the house. They climbed into the pickup and drove slowly across the field, high beams on. Nothing appeared in sight. Once they reached the farmyard, Harold helped Clay into the kitchen, where he washed the wound with peroxide, applied antiseptic, and carefully bandaged the shoulder with clean gauze. Clay winced at the pain but thanked his father for the prompt help. While his son was trying to recover, Harold struggled to understand how something like this could have happened in an ordinary soybean field. Memories of Vietnam surged back in those moments, for he felt the same tension and fear of an unknown enemy. But now he was no soldier, just a farmer trying to protect his family from an invisible creature. The night passed uneasily. From time to time, the dogs would burst into barking, but nothing else approached the house. Clay spent several sleepless hours wondering what kind of beast had attacked him. He recalled the force of the blow, remembered a foul stench right after he was knocked down, and couldn't figure out what sort of creature it might have been. At daybreak, Harold went into Clay's room to ask how he was feeling. Clay replied that the pain was bearable, but the questions still swirled in his mind. Harold suggested that they finally report the incident to the sheriff. He had previously been reluctant to involve the authorities, yet the attack on Clay was now a serious reason for an official inquiry. Clay agreed, though he doubted Hardy would take it all that seriously. While his father got the pickup ready to drive to the station, Clay tried to figure out how to explain what had happened. He gazed at his bandaged shoulder, still feeling weak and startled by the animal's speed. None of his earlier guesses seemed to fit the reality of what he had experienced, but staying silent any longer felt too dangerous. Sheriff Marcus Hardy came by the Bentleys the next morning. He'd known Harold for a long time and had helped him out a few years earlier when drunken hunters had trespassed on the farm. Hardy was known for not letting matters slide, even if the county rarely saw major crimes. As soon as he entered the house, he asked how Clay was doing. Clay, sitting in the kitchen with his shoulder wrapped up, briefly explained that a large animal had scratched him near the soybean field. Hardy asked to see the torn clothes, then pressed him for details about what exactly Clay had witnessed during the attack. Clay said he hadn't had time to get a good look at the creature, but he noted its powerful chest and long claws. He mentioned fur, and the fact that the beast moved on 2 legs, though it could also support itself on its front limbs. Harold added that he'd heard growling and had seen only a dark silhouette vanishing into the woods. The sheriff shook his head skeptically, remarking that a large dog or a bear might appear that way in the dark. After a short discussion, Hardy went outside and asked to see where the incident had occurred. Harold agreed to show him, though Clay suggested bringing a weapon. Hardy declined, saying he didn't believe there was a 2-legged animal running around. He did keep his service revolver on his belt, but he didn't feel the need to draw it without a confirmed threat in sight. Reaching the edge of the soybean field, Harold indicated the approximate spot of the attack. There were still marks on the ground and a bit of dried blood belonging to Clay. Hardy studied everything carefully, bending down to feel the soil for any paw or claw prints. But the ground was heavily trampled, and part of it had been crushed by pickup tracks. No clear footprints remained. Once back at his vehicle, the sheriff exhaled and said he couldn't find any concrete evidence confirming the existence of a mysterious creature. He did not doubt Clay had been injured, but he chalked it up to an aggressive dog, or perhaps a coyote that ran off when the pickup arrived. Harold kept silent, though he knew that what he'd witnessed was far more terrifying than some ordinary dog. Before leaving, Hardy noted that he would still check the nearby woods and fields for signs of bears. He considered the bear theory the most plausible, even if they were seldom spotted in those parts. Clay tried to argue that the creature had seemed wolf-like, but the sheriff only said to keep him posted on any further incidents, then drove away. Harold stood by the gate, watching the patrol SUV disappear. He understood that Hardy hadn't dismissed their story outright, but he also realized the sheriff wouldn't spark public alarm without stronger evidence. Clay frowned, reiterating that what he'd seen was neither a bear nor a dog, but something much more powerful and terrifying. That very day, rumors spread at an alarming rate. Several workers from Mike Hall's farm stopped at the local store and mentioned they had found a calf with its head ripped off. Nobody had heard shots or found tracks of a large predator, but the discovery itself was horrifying. Hall told the sheriff there had to be some vicious animal on the loose, or else someone staging these gruesome scenes. When news of the incident on Hall's farm reached him, Sheriff Hardy could no longer remain indifferent. A calf's decapitated body hinted at a level of brutality that couldn't be blamed on a regular wild dog or a random predator. He assembled a few deputies and launched a formal investigation. intending to visit every farm, question locals, and determine if there were other missing animals or attacks. On hearing about what happened at the neighbor's farm, Clay felt a mix of dread and fury. Once again, he recalled the force that had knocked him to the ground in the soybean field. If the creature could kill a calf and tear its head off, it truly had monstrous capabilities. Harold saw his son pacing in the yard, anxiously checking the fence. That evening, father and son discussed the situation on the porch. Harold admitted that now the sheriff would have to take the matter seriously. Word about the calf's torn-off head would spread quickly around the county, and people would be afraid to go out at night. The fur found on Mike Hall's farm was still being analyzed, with results expected in about a week. Sheriff Hardy was waiting on a lab in a neighboring town with the right equipment for genetic testing. Tensions were rising among local farmers as the rumors of the beast grew stronger. Mike Hall accused Harold of making everything up to distract from an old land dispute. Harold pointed to his missing goats and the shredded raccoon, arguing there was no way these events were mere coincidence. People in town whispered about giant wolves or illegally bred hybrids. They avoided going out after dark and kept their guns close by. Clay looked into installing cameras and floodlights. A few friends offered to lend him money, but Harold refused any kind of credit, haunted by the bitter lessons of past debts. Their talk of improved security measures led to arguments. Clay insisted they needed modern technology, while Harold argued that a rifle and sturdy fence were enough. Meanwhile, Mike Hall spread rumors that Harold was behind the attacks, staging them for some sort of land-related benefit. He pointed to their previous boundary dispute, claiming Harold might have hired people to kill his calves. Sheriff Hardy maintained a neutral stance, driving around the county, questioning witnesses. He knew the complaints weren't baseless. Animals really were going missing, and the scenes were too vicious to be the work of coyotes. But without the lab results, everyone was left to speculate. As the county waited on the lab's findings, anxiety mounted. People were scared to be outside at night and rigged up makeshift alarms. Neighbors asked Clay if he planned to organize patrols, but he had no idea how to fund such efforts. Rangers occasionally stopped by the Bentley's place, curious about the strange tracks. Harold shared all the facts, but he had no proof of a monster beyond his own experiences and Clay's stories. By the end of the week, there was still no news from the lab. Hall continued to blame Harold, who silently went about his farm work, while Clay was torn between protecting the place and lacking the money for top-notch security. Every so often, Sheriff Hardy dropped by to see them, noticing the fatigue and tension in their eyes. Fear and paranoia deepened throughout the county. No one could be sure if some beast was really on the loose, or what the tests on the fur would reveal. One morning, Clay walked out to the cornfield to check for new paths in the thicket. He saw that the wire had been lifted in one corner of the fence, as though someone or something had tried to squeeze inside. The footprints were unclear, but that alone was enough to rattle him. Harold saw his son's anxiety but still held firm on avoiding new debts. He wanted to see the sheriff's official findings and had no intention of investing in expensive cameras. The argument between father and son dragged on. Clay knew they needed extra measures, but his father stuck to traditional methods. Late at night, the farm lay in silence when Harold heard a strange noise coming from the pen. He opened the door, noticing the dim glow of the yard lights, and called for Clay. Clay sprang from bed, grabbed his rifle, and went outside. The air felt stifling and motionless, thick enough to weigh him down. They moved carefully along the fence, trying not to make any noise. They were less than 20 yards from the pen when an agonized bellow from the livestock cut through the darkness. Harold swung his flashlight beam forward and froze at the terrifying sight. A large young bull thrashing on the ground, and a wolf-like figure ripping into its flesh. The creature's fur dripped with fresh blood, and its eyes glowed eerily in the beam of light. Clay caught his foot on a piece of metal debris, stumbled, and fell hard, striking his knee. At that very moment the beast raised its head as if it had sensed them. Its muzzle was long, with bared fangs, and the body looked thickly muscled, almost human-like in build, yet far larger. Its limbs were powerful, with wide paws tipped in black claws. Harold braced the rifle to his shoulder, aiming, but had no time to shoot. The thing lunged toward the nearby trees, darting deep into the woods behind the pen. It moved so quickly that Harold's finger never squeezed the trigger. He only managed to see it sprinting on two legs streaked with blood, its claws outstretched, before it vanished into the foliage. Clay struggled upright, staring at the bull's motionless body. There was no doubt the animal was already dead. Father and son moved closer, seeing a massive tear across the bull's chest and bits of flesh scattered everywhere. Blood pooled into the dirt, mixing with the dust. Harold, an experienced veteran, felt real terror as he grasped that this wasn't just some starving predator, but something far worse. Clay's voice trembled as he asked if they should go after it, but Harold, still stunned, replied sharply that they shouldn't. He understood that they weren't ready to face whatever this creature was. The veteran knew better than to rush blindly into the darkness. Clutching the rifle, he felt his hands shake but tried to remain in control. They returned to the house without another word. Clay sank onto the porch steps, trying to steady his shaking knees and glancing at the flashlight, whose battery was nearly dead. Harold leaned against the wall, burying his face in his hands. He couldn't fathom how something could move that fast, appear to have a near-human intelligence, and be so ferocious. After a short rest, they decided to call the sheriff in the morning. Trying to track the beast by night was insane. Father and son sat in silence while the occasional faint gust of wind stirred the trees. Harold's pulse hammered in his temples, and he tried not to think of his wartime experiences. But the bloody image before his eyes brought those memories flooding back. At sunrise, Clay could hardly wait for the phone lines at the sheriff's office to open. The moment he heard Hardy's voice, he briefly recounted what had happened and asked him to come as soon as possible. The sheriff promised to arrive quickly, but urged them to collect any evidence they could before the sun's heat dried out the tracks. Harold nodded, though the sheriff couldn't see it, and stood up, knowing he'd have to look again at the bull's corpse. When they returned to the pen, the horrifying sight still caused their stomachs to churn. Clay walked a bit farther and spotted prints in the dirt, seemingly claw marks. There was no denying the existence of the beast. This was something very real. Becky arrived at the farm soon after. She'd heard about the incident that night and brought her tools and supplies to examine the bull's remains, hoping to figure out what type of predator they were dealing with. Harold guided her to the scene of the attack, where hot winds were already kicking up dust. Becky, a veterinarian with plenty of experience treating all sorts of animals, felt shaken by what she found. The bull lay on its side with ribs and internal organs so brutally torn, it looked like they'd been slashed with a razor-sharp blade. Several bones were broken in places that would have required far more force than any normal animal could exert. Becky refrained from jumping to conclusions, but said at once that she had never encountered anything like it. Clay came closer, watching her study the edges of the wounds. She pointed out the torn spots as well as cuts that looked startlingly clean, almost as though made by a knife. Suddenly, in one of the gashes, she found a tooth resembling a large canine from a big dog. pulling it out with forceps. Becky shook her head, as its size didn't match an ordinary wolf or dog. Harold stood by with his rifle, scanning the area as though fearing the creature might return. He asked Becky if it could have been staged with a blade or axe, planting the tooth as false evidence. She replied there would be no way to fake the power needed to snap a bull's bones in half. Her verdict was that this creature truly possessed the strength to break an animal of that size. Becky took out her camera and snapped several photos for later study. She planned to send them to a colleague who specialized in wildlife, hoping for any sort of insight. She urged Harold and Clay to be extremely careful, cautioning them that if this creature was as formidable as it seemed, it likely wouldn't be deterred by basic defenses. After examining the remains, Becky backed away, covering her face with one hand. She felt an overwhelming wave of revulsion and anxiety. The thought of a monster roaming somewhere nearby, capable of such brutality, was difficult for someone who normally approached nature with a rational mindset. She remembered her university lectures on predator anatomy, but found no clear parallels to what she saw here. Clay asked if they could learn anything from saliva or fluids left on the carcass. Becky admitted she didn't have the equipment for that sort of testing, but said they could pass samples to specialists. The problem was that the official agencies were already swamped analyzing the fur from Hall's farm. Becky worried that additional evidence might just get lost in a stack of paperwork and yield no immediate answers. Harold suggested she hold on to the photos and the tooth without going public yet. He suspected that if rumors started spreading about a half-intelligent wolf-like monster, panic would soar, forcing Sheriff Hardy into drastic measures, even declaring a state of emergency. Becky understood his concern, but believed the situation was already critical. Before leaving, she reminded Harold to keep his gun at hand. She told Clay not to venture into the fields alone and to avoid the woodland edges at dusk. She emphasized that human life mattered far more than any potential harvest profits. Harold nodded silently, and Clay walked her back to her pickup, wondering what she would tell her wildlife specialist if she decided to send those photos. In early September, the corn in the Bentley's fields reached the stage where the stalks and leaves stood tall and dense. The harvest was planned for a couple of weeks later, but Harold and Clay decided they couldn't wait. They needed to find out whether the creature was hiding among the overgrown rows, because the cornfield stretched almost half a mile from the house. Any predator could hide easily in such thick growth. That evening, as the sun was setting, they took their rifles and flashlights and ventured into the field. Each row of corn rose to about 8 feet high, and the space between stalks was narrow. Harold suggested they move slowly and quietly, occasionally placing metal snare traps. Clay wasn't sure such devices would help catch something within human strength, but they had no better plan. They had covered about 200 yards when they heard a soft cracking sound, as if someone had stepped on a dry twig. Harold stopped and raised his hand, signaling Clay to be silent. Up ahead, leaves were rustling, but nothing definite was visible. Clay noted that the dogs weren't following them, having chosen to remain at the farm. It was a troubling sign, given that the dogs had always willingly accompanied them into the fields before. Clay's heart beat faster than usual, and the tension in the air pressed on his nerves. Remembering his recent attack, he knew the creature could strike suddenly and vanish without a sound. Harold, walking in front, tried not to look around too much, avoiding any unnecessary movement that might give them away. They set up a few makeshift snares, tying them to the cornstalks, then continued deeper. By the time twilight gave way to near total darkness, the flashlights were their only source of light. In those beams, the corn leaves glowed, forming eerie corridors. Harold stopped, pointing at something ahead, Clay moved closer and saw a trampled area where the stalks had been cut down to their roots, and the ground was strewn with bits of bone. A sharp stench of rotting meat hit them. Examining more closely, Clay made out fragments of deer hair and pieces of bone, including part of a deer skull. Apparently, the creature had been using this spot as a feeding ground for some time. Harold knelt, looking over claw marks on the damp soil. The tracks were bigger than those of a normal wolf and dug deep into the earth. He sighed, realizing that their suspicions about the beast's unnatural strength were well-founded. Just then, a rustling sound came from a neighboring row. Harold shone his flashlight, and for a moment they saw a silhouette. The creature was crouched, tearing at scraps of what seemed to be deer meat. It wasn't looking in their direction, but the tension hung thick in the air. Clay felt his insides clench, yet both he and his father realized this was their chance to catch the beast off guard. They began to move closer, rifles at the ready, trying to make as little noise as possible on the soft ground. Each step risked alerting the creature. When they were about 15 yards away, it suddenly lifted its head. Its eyes glinted in the flashlight's beam, and Clay made out a wolf-like muzzle with more prominent cheekbones. Thick muscles rolled beneath coarse, dark fur, and its teeth were bared in a half-growl. The beast dropped the gnawed chunk of meat and let out a short, harsh snarl. Harold acted immediately, aiming and pulling the trigger. The shot shattered the silence. The creature jerked sideways, but from the sound it seemed the bullet grazed its shoulder. A low, anguished howl rang out, and the monster charged straight at them. Harold dropped to one knee, preparing to shoot again, but the creature zigzagged as though trying to confuse their aim. Clay also fired, but missed. Adrenaline made him shake. His bullet struck the corn stalks instead. With a fierce roar, the beast veered off, slipping into the adjacent rows. Father and son took off after it, struggling not to lose sight of the moving leaves. The chase lasted only seconds, but felt like an eternity. The corn rustled and snagged on their clothes, while the flashlight beams snatched at darting shadows. They nearly caught up, but then the creature abruptly changed direction, as if realizing it was being pursued by two people. Harold kept firing short bursts, but the thick stalks blocked his view. One shot hit the dirt, sending up a spray of dust. The beast seemed enraged, or at least threatened. It kept turning its head to let out piercing snarls. Clay's heart pounded so loudly he thought it might drown out the sound of his own footsteps. They reached the edge of the cornfield where the rows thinned. In the moonlight, Harold saw the monster, limping as it crossed open ground toward a low bluff by the river. Clay raised his rifle, hoping for a clear shot, but the beast disappeared behind the slope, and for a brief instant they heard only the sound of labored breathing. Harold stopped, panting, and swore under his breath, realizing a wounded creature might be even more dangerous. Clay strained to see where their target had gone, but darkness and thick brush by the river concealed it completely. Father and son exchanged worried glances. The creature was still free, and now it knew they were ready to fight. They decided to return to the spot deep in the field where they had found its makeshift lair, hoping to discover more concrete clues or signs of the creature's nature. Back at that gruesome scene, their fear multiplied. The deer bones, torn fur, and congealed blood made it clear the monster had been there for some time. Likely it hadn't wandered in by chance, but had adapted to the surroundings, knowing the trails and how to hide. Clay crouched next to a bone that looked like part of a deer antler, broken off at the base of the skull. His throat tightened, realizing this thing was feeding on wild game, and possibly venturing out to neighboring fields for more prey. Harold was silent, trying to steady his breathing. He knew that the next encounter could be even more dangerous. A wounded beast might seek revenge or flee far away. They emerged from the corn maze well past midnight. Clay was still trembling, while Harold tried to figure out how many rounds they had left. They had to decide whether to inform the sheriff about their unsuccessful hunt. Hardy might call for a large-scale manhunt, which could turn chaotic and even lead to more casualties. Yet the image of that predator crouched over its kill left them no real choice. Harold understood they couldn't handle this alone. Before bed, they agreed to wait until morning, discuss the details with the sheriff, and show him the creature's lair. By morning, Sheriff Hardy arrived at the Bentleys with 2 deputies and a group of volunteer farmers. He carried a folder containing the lab results. The sheriff reported that the analyzed fur didn't match any known species of wolf, dog, or coyote. The findings pointed to anomalous mutations, but there were no definitive explanations. Hardy admitted the data was too vague to involve federal agencies, yet it was clear the situation went beyond simple poaching. He suggested combing the nearby woodlands and cornfields using a drive hunt strategy. Volunteers were given radios, flares, and firearms. Only a few people had rifle licenses. The rest carried shotguns or hunting guns. Harold and Clay led the sheriff to the spot where they had seen the beast's lair the previous night. The group split into smaller teams with a meeting point set along the edge of the woods. The air was stifling, and heavy clouds loomed over the fields. People walked with caution, fully aware that an encounter with the creature could be deadly. As they proceeded, Clay asked about the genetic anomalies mentioned in the report. Hardy replied that it referenced a strange combination of wolf and human markers, but the researchers hadn't gone into detail. It seemed they didn't want to delve deeper, limiting themselves to mentions of rare deviations. Harold frowned, realizing that these conclusions suggested something truly extraordinary. Suddenly, shouts came from the western edge of the field. People were calling for the sheriff, mentioning that visibility was dropping sharply, and they thought they saw the beast moving. It turned out the first drops of rain had begun to fall, intensifying into a downpour. By evening, the sky had grown completely dark, with flashes of lightning illuminating the horizon. Radio signals began to fade, and the wind howled through the corn stalks, creating a noise that made it hard to keep one's bearings. Hardy decided to cut the search short and send everyone home to avoid getting lost in the storm. Harold and Clay returned to the farm, guessing the creature might have hidden away for a while or retreated deeper into the woods. That night, the storm grew fiercer and damaged the power lines, plunging the house into darkness. The generator in the barn wouldn't start immediately due to old wiring issues. Everything was enveloped in complete blackness. Harold found several battery-powered lanterns and placed them near the front door. Clay double-checked the rifles and shotgun to make sure they were loaded. The dogs howled loudly in their kennel, sensing the threat and trembling at the thunder's roar. At one point, a bolt of lightning lit up the yard and revealed a figure on the porch. There stood the creature, unmoving despite the driving rain. It appeared wounded, judging by its slightly slumped shoulder and labored breathing. It stood on 2 legs, its long claws gripping the porch railing. Its eyes glinted, reflecting the flashes of the storm. Harold, summoning every ounce of courage, raised his rifle. Clay stood beside him, clutching the old shotgun. Surprisingly, the monster didn't lunge at them immediately. It hesitated, lifting its head and letting out a lower growl than before. You could see its broad chest rising between the rolls of thunder. The moment seemed endless. Then the creature finally took a step forward. Harold pulled the trigger, and the shot tore through the silence. The bullet struck the beast in the chest, It staggered but lunged toward Clay with claws extended. Clay managed to fire the shotgun, aiming near its heart. The creature toppled off the porch with a short wheeze, rolling into the mud. When Clay ran to it, his flashlight revealed a half-naked human body, limbs twisted and covered in strange scars. The sheriff arrived moments later and found them standing over that same figure, a being that seemed part wolf, part man. It lay there, lifeless. Hardy shone his flashlight over the body, searching in vain for any form of ID or identifiable markings. All he found were a few scars across its chest and shoulders. Rain lashed the porch, and the thunder rumbled in the distance. Amid the frenzied barking of the dogs and the last flashes of lightning, Harold and Clay realized the monster was dead. It still wasn't clear what or who it had been before. At the sheriff's instruction, they moved the body to the barn, planning to wait for sunrise and call medical professionals. Dark stains of blood remained on the ground, gradually washing away in the downpour. The wolfman no longer breathed. The next day, Sheriff Hardy summoned the coroner from a nearby town to collect the mysterious body of the man who, in his final moments, had lived as a monstrous creature. Reporters, having caught wind of a shooting at the farm, arrived quickly, but local authorities cordoned off the property, citing danger and confidentiality. Over the phone, Hardy arranged with the county administration to keep the details under wraps. Clay stood by the window, watching as the coroner's pickup drove away, disappearing around the bend. He still couldn't believe that the beast terrorizing their farm turned out to be a human being with bizarre physical alterations. Harold thought about how his life had been turned upside down in the past few weeks, and how fragile their familiar farming routine really was. Becky, who arrived to find out what happened, spoke with Hardy. She wanted to take tissue samples and send them to specialists outside the state, but the sheriff said he'd been told to remain silent. Perhaps higher-ups didn't want public frenzy over something they couldn't explain. Becky understood that if the authorities wanted it hushed up, her own efforts wouldn't change much. Harold and Clay, standing alone on the porch, couldn't find the words to express what they were feeling. The tension of the previous weeks had abruptly ended, replaced by an uneasy void. Harold felt a sharp pang, knowing he had shot a creature with human features, a being possibly under some curse or victim of a genetic mutation. Clay kept reliving the moment he pulled the trigger, weighed down by guilt despite knowing that if he hadn't acted, the creature might have killed them both. 2 days after the body was taken away, journalists tried to run a story. However, the local administration issued a statement that the culprit was an unknown, possibly mentally ill drifter who had attacked livestock. Any photographs reporters managed to snap were blurry and didn't clearly show the nature of the beast. All details about wolf-like fur and abnormal limbs were suppressed. Sheriff Hardy officially closed the case, stating the threat had been neutralized and more attacks prevented. A few farmers shook their heads in confusion, remembering the rumors about a half-wolf creature that had spread earlier. But now everyone seemed eager to forget the strange incident. Becky decided to leave the county for a while, telling Clay she would send the photos and samples to a biologist she knew. Perhaps a private lab could uncover something, but officially her hands were tied. Clay only nodded, knowing neither he nor his father intended to stop her. No one could predict how unknown agencies might react if news of a wolfman leaked to the press. In the days that followed, Harold tried to get back to normal farm work. He harvested the corn, checked on the livestock, and inspected the pens. Clay helped him, no longer arguing about installing cameras. They silently agreed that the threat was gone and no one wanted a repeat of the nightmarish attacks. Yet deep down, they both realized they had witnessed something that defied any simple explanation. Before long, All talk of a wolfman faded, overtaken by other local news. People went on with their lives, only occasionally recalling there had been a shooting at the Bentley farm involving a wild beast. Clay still dreamed of that bloodied muzzle, and Harold tried not to dwell on the fact that in their quiet corner of Georgia there were powers and mysteries beyond ordinary understanding.